squeeze on its heavy feet. Anne's eyes and mouth opened wide, but she couldn't scream. Suddenly, she saw it. A giant gorilla, about 8 meters tall. She couldn't take her eyes off his ugly black face. He was an intelligent animal. She could see that in his eyes. On his face were old cuts from many fights. Suddenly, he roared louder than before. Anne screamed. The islanders up above her on the wall cried and screamed too. Kong put out his large black hand and easily pulled Anne from the ropes. He carried her away into the thick jungle. Then she heard guns. "Too late! You're too late!" she cried. Engelhorn and the sailors shot into the sky, and the islanders ran into the ruins. Some ran to their houses. When Jack was almost to the wall, he heard Anne's screams. Then he heard the loud, angry roar of an animal. "What was that?" Engelhorn asked. Jack couldn't answer. He climbed up the stairs next to the wall. He looked down at Carl. Carl's eye was at a small opening in the wall. When he moved back, his face was white. "What is it?" Jack shouted. "What can you see?" Carl didn't answer. At the top, Jack looked down. He could see the rocks and statues below, and the nearest trees were on fire. "I can't see her," he shouted to the other men. Carl knew. A giant gorilla, something from another world, had Anne. "I would really like to film that giant," he thought. "Is it possible? Yes, I can do it, and I'll be famous." It was a dangerous plan, but he had to do it. Hayes arrived on the island with more sailors and more guns. He walked over to Carl and looked at him angrily. "What did you see, Denham?" Hayes asked. "What kind of animal is it?" "I don't know," he said. "I think it was a kind of gorilla." Jack tried to break open a door at the bottom of the wall. He couldn't do it, so Hayes shot it open with his gun. Then he gave Jack a gun. But when Hayes saw Jimmy with a gun in his hands, he took it away. "Not you, Jimmy," Hayes said. "I want to help. I'm a man, not a boy," Jimmy said to Hayes. "You're staying here," Hayes answered. Carl, Herb, and Preston had the cameras and film for this trip into the jungle. Engelhorn watched them angrily, but he said nothing. "I'm going to save Miss Darrow and my job," Carl told him. Bruce Baxter also had a gun, but for the first time, it wasn't for a movie. Hayes and 10 sailors were ready, but Engelhorn and the other men stayed behind. "You have guns and food and 24 hours, Engelhorn said. "At this time tomorrow, we're sailing out of here." Jack pushed through the open door, and the other men followed. The night was dark, and strange noises came from the jungle. Suddenly, the men heard a very loud noise, and everything moved. Was it an animal? They shot at it, but they couldn't see it. It fell noisily at their feet, dead. "It's a dinosaur!" shouted one of the sailors. Carl quickly took his camera from Herb, but before he could do anything, there was another dinosaur in front of them. They tried to kill the dinosaur, but it ran at them. Hayes shot it between the eyes, and it fell to the ground. Kong ran with Anne in his hand up to the top of some rocks. When he sat down, he looked at her face carefully, and she looked at his. Kong turned her, head down and feet up, and below her she saw the skulls of many dead people. She screamed. Then she heard a shot a long way away. "Jack!" she screamed. "I hope he finds me," she thought. Later on that dark night, Jack and the other men arrived at the same place. But Anne wasn't there. They saw the skulls and were afraid for her. Hayes turned his head and saw one of the sailors with his hat down over his face. He pulled the hat off. It was Jimmy, with a gun in his hands. "What are you doing here?" Hayes asked. "You're too young." "I want to help," Jimmy said. "I want to find Miss Darrell." Hayes turned away. "Come, let's go," he shouted to his men. 5 hours later, the morning sun was hot, and they were very tired. They had to stop and put down their heavy guns. Carl didn't want to lose a minute. He had to film Bruce. He said, "Come here, Bruce." "Ready, Herb?" "Why don't we wait for Anne?" Preston said. "Look at this place," Herb said. "It's as good as money in the bank. This movie isn't about her now." A very loud noise came out from behind some trees. The men's eyes opened wide, and then about 100 dinosaurs ran at them. Hayes screamed, "Run!" More dinosaurs ran down from some high rocks. The men ran for their lives, but the dinosaurs were very fast. 2 men died under their feet. Bruce turned and shot one dinosaur. It fell heavily, and then other dinosaurs fell on top of it. Carl and Jack fell too. Jack quickly climbed out from under a dinosaur and ran. "Go!" Hayes shouted to Jack. Then he killed 2 more dinosaurs. "Where's Carl?" Jack shouted. "Carl? Carl!" Carl climbed out from under a dinosaur with his camera in his arms. The 2 men ran as fast as their legs could go. Hayes killed more dinosaurs, and then he followed them. The men quickly climbed up some very high rocks, but the dinosaurs were right behind them. One of the sailors fell. A dinosaur caught him in its big teeth. The man screamed. With his camera in one hand, Carl put out his other hand to Herb. "Herb, quickly!" he shouted. "Take my hand!" Herb put out his hand, but his leg turned suddenly and he fell. 3 or 4 dinosaurs quickly caught him in their teeth and ate him. Carl felt weak and sick. His eyes and mouth opened wide, but he couldn't scream. "Carl! Come!" shouted one of the men above him. End of CD 1. CD 2. Chapter 4. A Past World. Afraid, Anne looked around. "How many dinosaurs are here? With Kong, I'm safe," she thought. So she followed him. The men followed Hayes to a safe place between some high rocks. There was only Carl, Jack, Preston, Bruce, Hayes, Jimmy, and 5 or 6 sailors now. They stopped for 5 minutes, and Lumpy looked angrily at Carl. Jack was angry at Carl too now, because Carl loved his camera more than his friends. The ground in front of them was very wet and dangerous. "How much rope do we have?" Jack asked Hayes. "Are you crazy, Jack? We can't go across there," Lumpy shouted. One of the sailors said, "She's dead, and we are too." "Let's go back," Bruce said. "We only have 9 hours before the ship sails." "We have to find Miss Darrow," shouted Jimmy. "She's dead, Jimmy," Bruce said quietly. Jack heard him and looked angrily into his eyes. "Herb is dead," Carl said to Preston. "But we have to finish this job for him. He wanted this film as much as I did. Do. The money from it will help his wife and children." "We'll do it, boss. For Herb," Preston said. They had to live and work for something, or die. Preston knew this. Kong ran through the jungle with Anne in his hand and pushed over trees in his way. Suddenly, an ugly great dinosaur jumped out at Kong and tried to take Anne in its teeth. She screamed. Kong roared angrily. Then another dinosaur tried to get her, but Kong killed it easily with his free hand. He put Anne down when they came to some very old ruins. Then he sat down with his back to her. Anne's arms, legs, and head hurt. She looked around and saw some stairs. Quietly, she slowly moved across the ground on her stomach. "Will I get away this time?" she hoped. Suddenly, she jumped up and ran for the stairs. But before she could get away, Kong's hand hit the ground in front of her. He roared angrily. She stopped. She could do nothing. Kong watched her with his dark, sad eyes. Then he turned and walked into the jungle. He climbed over the wall of a ruin. Anne watched him go. She didn't know the way out of the jungle, but she had to try again. "He can't see me now. I'm free. But are the men looking for me? I hope they are," she thought. "We have to get across that wet ground," Hayes said. "We'll use the wood from these trees and build boats." The men worked quickly with trees and ropes, and after a half-hour they were ready. Jack looked around him at the dead trees in the water. "This really is another world," he thought. Jack hated this wild island, but he couldn't leave without Anne. Suddenly, the boats hit something under the water. "What was that?" shouted Lumpy. Something jumped out of the black water and turned their boats over. The men screamed and fell. A giant fish opened its mouth and hungrily took a sailor with its long teeth. The water went red. Jack saw, but he couldn't help. There were vines around his legs, and he couldn't get free. His head went under the water. Then it came up and went under again. He heard a shout from Carl. "Don't lose it, Preston! Don't lose the camera!" Suddenly, Carl shot the fish. Jack got his legs free of the vines and swam with Carl. The other men swam too. But then the giant fish came up out of the water again. With its large teeth, it took another sailor. He screamed for help, but nobody could do anything for him. When they were on dry ground, the men stood quietly. They looked sadly at the red water. Hayes remembered his time in France. 191 days of fighting. The dead men, his friends. This wasn't very different. He turned away from the water and looked around him. "Look at the ground," he said to the men. "That giant walked through here." Suddenly, there was a loud noise, and Hayes quickly turned around. A dead dinosaur was on the ground behind him. Smoke came from Jimmy's gun. "Don't think you're so smart," Hayes said to Jimmy. "You're too young for this." Jimmy felt bad. "I know you don't think much of me," he said angrily to Hayes. Hayes walked away. "He loves you, Jimmy," Lumpy said. "He doesn't want to lose you. Don't be angry." Jimmy wanted to be a man. He wanted Hayes to understand that.